Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Thursday, December 14th, 2023. Tonight's topic is one that's very, very difficult. There are no easy solutions, and I'm going to try to limit my content tonight to really delve into the process. We're going to talk about school refusal tonight. I did this one a few years ago, and I thought to myself, it's about time to do it again because the pandemic had such a dramatic impact on our children, on their mental health, on their anxiety, on their experience with school anxiety and school attendance. So it wouldn't make much sense to not do one in the wake of the pandemic and the impact that it had upon all of us. So that's where I'm coming from this evening. I wanted to start off before I get into some of the specific content tonight. Boy, that's a tough start. Before I get into the specific content tonight, I want to share a couple of the posts that I've shared in the last 2 days. I felt somewhat inspired to write these and thought they were applicable to tonight's topic in a deeper way. Let me clear my throat and then I'm going to get back to you. When you have a tickle in your throat at the end, that's doable. When you have a tickle in your throat in the first 1 minute, it's kind of anxiety producing. But like I said, I want to share with you a couple of posts that I've been inspired by or inspired to share over the last couple of days. I think they relate to the topic more generally. Like I said, as we delve deeper into what is the underlying issues, the background noise of school refusal. The first one reads as this: codependency is looking for solutions outside of me, changing others, controlling others, to the problems that are inside of me, the inner peace and serenity that I seek. So as I begin tonight, I get so many questions about school refusal and what to do about it. And I'm going to try to explain this idea. It's never about what you do. You have to make a decision, and skills and tools matter. And having some language to navigate some of these difficult situations and topics is important. But more fundamental than that is the way that you think and feel about the child, your perspective. I've talked about this before, that the outcome of therapy, successful therapy, in my perspective, is not a doing outcome, that you do things differently. Sometimes definitely you do things differently as a result of therapy. But really the outcome of successful, effective therapy is that you yourself are changed in the process. It's who you become in the process. And in my mind, it is that you become a more authentic, genuine, grounded version of yourself, the part of yourself that existed before the world came in and told you who you should be. So as we think about this idea, I want to ground it in this idea that if we don't address the internal workings, the lack of serenity, the lack of peace of mind, the lack of confidence, the presence of anxiety or depression, if we don't address those, it doesn't matter what we do. And I know that as parents, we have a responsibility and an obligation to our children, but it is with that obligation and that responsibility that I speak to you this evening. That there are things more important than their behaviors. And I'll talk about that as we go along tonight. And then I shared this today. I wrote, nobody likes feeling afraid, anxious, hurt, or insecure. And of course, you can add to that list other feelings. Nobody likes feeling anxious, afraid, hurt, or insecure. But here's the thing: if you don't feel those feelings and you don't deal with them, you don't grapple with them, you don't face them, what happens is you'll project onto the people that you love, your partners, your spouse, and your child, anger and criticism. You'll seek, in essence, to change them because it will seem to you, it will very much seem to you and be clear in your mind that the problem is the other person. My child not going to school, for example, my child using drugs, my spouse not paying attention to time or not respecting, what time that he or she or they said that they would show up to something. So if we don't take on the project of feeling our feelings, if we don't take on the project of the things that the wounds, the trauma, the programming, the unhealed, undealt with issues that we carry in our body, if we don't deal with those, we'll experience the problem as outside of us. We'll think if I can just get this promotion, if I can just get past this project, if I can just get my spouse or my child more in line, then I will be okay. And I think everybody can relate to that. And especially anybody that's watching or listening to this broadcast who's done the introspective work that is invited by these podcasts, you know that experience resonates with you. So as I start off tonight, I want to be clear about something. I don't know what you should do. I don't know what the answer is. And I'll talk about everything from the psychological approach to the behavioral techniques that we can access or use or reference as we think about modifying behavior. But as I've going through this with my fourth child, who struggles with this very issue of school refusal, I've had to come to terms with the fact that I can focus on school attendance, I can focus on grades, similar to the way that I did with my first child who went through wilderness therapy. I can focus on that and try to employ all of my tools and skills and behavioral modification to try to get the behavior that I want, or I can pay attention to the attachment, to the connection. As I said recently to my wife not too long ago, I said, I want to put my money where my mouth is, so to speak. I want to act as if the principles that I teach are true. And that's going to be a radical departure from focusing on grades and school attendance. And because I have a child, this is my second of four that has this tendency, because I have a child who is willing to take the power struggle all the way, we could end up on a hospital gurney. We could end up in a very, very serious place because she's willing to with a kind of incredible tenacity to fight for her unmet needs, for what's going on with her and her mental health. And for her, school is secondary to that, to feeling okay and safe in her body. So this is not going to be one where I talk to you about specific things that you should do. I'll give you some ideas, some options, but really it's about developing a sensibility. And I use that word a lot. And what that word means is how you think and feel, how you see yourself and the child in relationship, how you see the child as a human being. And that kind of sensibility, the way that we see our child, the way that we see ourselves in our relationship to them and their problems, that's more important than any kind of behavioral modification in my experience, in my perspective. And the first invitation at looking at things differently is this. You can apply this to virtually any kind of behavioral problem: drugs, alcohol, self-harm, school refusal, general rebellion, the list goes on. And here it is. Instead of thinking of the symptom that we're focusing on, instead of thinking of the symptom as the problem, you can think of the symptom as the solution. And then the question is, what problem is it solving? What problem is the acting out behavior solving for the individual, for the child, or for you, for that matter, for any of us? And once you begin to look at and ask a different question, right? Therapy is not about giving answers to all of your questions, but it's about learning to ask different kinds of questions. What I would consider to be better or more evolved questions as we go along. Sometimes, especially in my open form Q&As, it's difficult to, and you'll find this when you listen to me enough, it's difficult to answer some of the questions because I don't even agree with the premise that underlies the question. For example, when I get asked the question of what should I do in XYZ circumstance. And so you'll find me talking about principles, ideas, telling stories or parables or metaphors to again invite you into a different way of thinking about all of this life, what it means to be a person, to struggle, and to be in relationship to a child. A fundamental idea in psychology is to understand the function of the symptom. Even though some of the choices that our children make, that people make, may seem irrational. There is simple logic at the root of their behavior. We just don't have access to it. I was just sharing this with my daughter the other day. I don't know if I shared it the other night, but when I was in ninth grade, I think I did share it the other night. When I was in ninth grade, I looked up to Mr. Antonor. He was a young teacher, so he's probably somewhere around alive and kicking and teaching. And I loved him, and I wanted to. I sought his attention. I didn't grow up with a father, and that might have something to do with it. But I just really loved Mr. Antnor and wanted him to be proud of me. Wanted him to see me as smart, as valuable, as worthy of love. And the pressure and the anxiety of the potential failure of this hope and this dream was so significant that I decided at one point to fail his class. He even called me up after a test that he knew that I knew the answers. I got every question wrong on it on purpose. Because part of me deep down inside was that I wanted to be seen, I wanted to be understood. And he asked me, what happened here? He said, it's impossible, just statistically speaking, virtually, for you to get all these questions wrong, especially the first 15 of them, which are true and false. And I wanted to tell him that I was scared. I wanted to tell him that I was hurting and afraid, but I just couldn't bring myself to it. And he gently pushed a little bit on me to see what was going on, and I wouldn't give it to him. And I remember even to this moment, something happened 40 years ago. I remember him feeling defeated because he couldn't reach me. So while it might make no sense, even my failure served a purpose. It relieved me of the anxiety of trying and failing. I'd rather sink my own ship than to have it toppled over by the waves of life. And in that purposeful, even though it was private, sinking of my own ship, I gained this sense of control over things, and I lost the anxiety. Examples of functions of the symptoms include, and by no means are limited to these several ideas, but the pain, number one, the pain of the behavior, whatever it is, acting out, the pain of the behavior is better than the pain that would come from not behaving this way. That's simple, right? There's a reason. We assume, first of all, that there's a reason. I would rather be in trouble with my parents than to continue to feel like an outsider among my peers. That makes sense, right? I would rather violate the family's rules and values to feel that sense of belonging with my peers, which becomes so important, developmentally speaking, and is where I spend most of my time as a teenager or a young adult. I'd rather be in trouble with my parents than continue to feel like an outsider amongst my peers. I would rather fail than feel the fear of failure. That goes back to my ninth grade sociology class with Mr. Antonor. I would rather cut myself and feel that pain than have an absence of feeling, to feel lost, powerless, numb. There are several, of course, other reasons to self-harm, but that's just one example. I would rather drink or smoke pot and feel this high than feel stressed or bored or insecure. I would rather piss off my parents than feel the crushing guilt and disappointment of trying to please them and failing. I say this to parents all the time. I've said over the years, I would say to a parent, your child wants you to be proud of them. They want to please you. And they will respond to me incredulously saying, well, everything that they're doing violates what we hope and expect of them. The parent will say, inevitably, we love them no matter what. But the child doesn't have that experience, doesn't feel that in their bones. They feel that love is contingent, conditional. They feel the parent's anger, disappointment, frustration, exhaustion. They feel that and the related pulling away that the parent does in situations like that. They feel that threat. So again, I could go on with more examples of what does the symptom serve, what's the function of it, but it's just important that you accept the idea that there is a function to the symptom. When parents ask me what's going on with my child, fair question, and you're asking the right person. It is my job to try to find answers to that question about what's happening and why. But when that same parent asks it again and again and again, there's a part of me that wants to say to them, to respond, to say, you need to figure that out. You need to figure out your child. You need to see them. And I know seeing them and understanding their dilemma, for example, let me just use this as an example. Making sense out of a child's school refusal and even having some empathy for it is terrifying, because we think we've been taught that to love and to accept somebody, even in the context of bad behavior, to show them compassion and empathy, even for the behavior that they're exhibiting, is going to lead to absolute anarchy and chaos, to a full scale rebellion with no shame or no guilt. But of course, it has just the opposite effect. The more we understand our children, the more we understand each other, the more that we are understood, the more that we tend to heal, to evolve, to unravel the behavior and to come to some kind of healthy, higher functioning resolution. So it is your job to understand, and at least from the starting point of just assume that there is a function of the symptom. It goes to the chapter in my book that I was reluctant to write. If I'd had my initial preference, I should say, I wouldn't have written chapter 5 of The Journey of the Heroic Parent, because I didn't want to write another book that just explained behavioral theory. It's really simple. It to me is cold. It's like talking about dog training, but I realized that if I don't write this chapter, people are going to ask about it. So I'm going to write about it, give some basic principles. Then I'm going to teach all of the psychology that surrounds the idea of behavior modification. And this opening epigraph of the chapter is really, again, the essence of what I wanted to share and teach, what I'm talking about tonight. And I wrote this: using behavioral tools is fine, but only if they are nested in love and awareness. And we would be wise to first listen to what the behavior is telling us before we launch into changing it. Because if we just learn to apply an effective behavioral technique and we're able to alter the behavior, we still haven't addressed the core issue, the core wound, the core trauma, the core anxiety or fear or pain of what is there. And what will happen, just like cutting a weed off at the root, it will appear somewhere else in our garden. It will crop up somewhere else. It will find the light of day again somewhere else. The simple idea of operant conditioning, the behavioral theory that we understand, there are basically 4 ways of thinking about behavioral management. 2 of them are reinforcing of behavior. In other words, we encourage behavior that we want to see or behavior that we are seeing, we encourage it to increase. That's the reinforcement side of the 4-box paradigm. And then the other side is punishment, decreasing behavior. And the 4 categories include positive reinforcement. You add something to increase behavior. You give a reward, a treat, a token system, a privilege. Positive punishment, that's a strange one, is you add something to decrease behavior. The traffic signs on the freeway that say speed limit 55, 55 to 60, $100 fine. 60 to 65, $150 fine. That's a positive punishment. I'm trying to decrease a behavior by adding something to the environment, adding a stimulus. Negative reinforcement is to remove something to increase behavior. So in this case, we remove something uncomfortable so the behavior will increase. We remove, for example, if your child is biting their fingernails and you find yourself nagging and complaining, but that serves a secondary gain for them of getting attention. For example, allow for the triteness of the example. We remove our criticism so that we want to see them, not chewing on their fingernails, treating their fingernails well. Negative punishment is to remove something to decrease behavior. Remove something in the environment that is unpleasant in order to see behavior increase. So you can think about it. The most common ones are positive reinforcement. the punishment example, the punishment side of the paradigm, it's very difficult because punishment tells you what not to do, but it doesn't tell you what to do. One of the undesired effects of the punishment side of the continuum is that people just learn to avoid being seen. We learn to look for police officers that might be checking our speed. We don't stop speeding. We just get better at scanning the environment, and we look for that highway patrol who might catch us. Right? We learn to avoid instead of actually change our behavior, change what's going on. That's not the bulk of this. You can remove and add and be creative about it, and you can do that. That can be a part of it. I encourage you to try those things, privileges, consequences. I prefer privileges more than negative consequences when possible. I like the idea of keeping a child, giving them a lot of positive things in their life as a baseline, so that when you take away not everything, not over punish, but when you take away something, take away a privilege, that the child is more inclined to still have hope, to not be overwhelmed by it. It's like they get used to the luxuries, right? They get used to the privileges and they want to continue. So there's no secrets with behavioral theory, behavioral reinforcement. There are really, it's not a very complex and nuanced theory. We can do it with Pavlov's dogs, right? Ring a bell and the dog salivates. That's a different kind of reinforcement theory than operant conditioning. But the point is, we can use behavioral theory, rewards and punishments to modify behavior pretty simply. But then, as I find with the parents that I work with, the parent will say, "Well, what if it doesn't work?" Well, then the behavioral theory suggests that you increase the pressure, the energy in this area. Maybe switch it around a little bit. Then the parent will inevitably ask, "Well, what if it doesn't work again?" And then you get into a place where there might be a power struggle. And then you get into a place where the behavioral theory is fueled by the parent's anger and frustration. That's another thing that's a limitation of the punishment side, is that it feels good to punish sometimes. We don't like to say that out loud, but it's true. It's cathartic to punishment, to yell, to take away privileges, to give somebody a consequence. It can feel satisfying. And the risk with that idea is that now you're not really treating the child and what they need. You're just satisfying your own emotional needs in the process at their expense. And then the difficulty becomes if the child is tough enough. What's the word? Tenacious, feisty, willful, like a couple of my children are, and like I love children that are these ways. These are the people that I'm drawn to in life. These are what the artists and creators of the world are like, right? They're willing to fight past the struggle. If you have a child with that characteristic, with those personalities issues, then they're going to escalate as you escalate. And then you have a child that goes from self-harm to a suicide attempt, right? You have a child that goes from school refusal to getting arrested. And now you're dealing with more. And if you continue to apply more and more behavioral theory, you miss inevitably what's going on underneath. Almost the most consistent thing that people will share, adults will share with me in our intensive work at Evoke. Because the intensives that we do, it's not psychoeducation, it is therapy. It's a therapeutic experience. And what they will come to realize, maybe as much as any insight that I hear people share during our intensive process, is that they will say something along the lines of, my parents were never concerned with what was going on inside of me. They weren't interested in my inner world. They were interested in my behavior, my grades, my performance, what they could see outside of me. And these are parents of children that are struggling. These are parents that are coming for marital issues or stage of life issues or anxiety or depression or codependency, right? They're not coming because they're the identified patient. They're coming as the non-identified patient. And even those folks, and I would venture to say, if it's not the most common realization, it's right up there near the top. The complaint when they explore their childhood is that their parents didn't take the time to look inside the child, to be curious about what's going on inside of the child. So let's talk about some considerations as you consider your response. Does it feel like high stakes? Sometimes, sometimes we think that everything is life or death. My therapist tells the story when her son, who now is a very successful and prominent attorney, but when her son was growing up, she one time saw him playing video games and putting off and procrastinating what my therapist thought was an important assignment, and she found herself in a moment in a fit of rage, saying to her son, "You know, you're never going to amount to anything." She looks back at this now, something that happened 25 years ago, with some kind of shame, some kind of regret. And she, of course, contextualizes the whole thing with mentioning the fact that her child graduated from a Ivy League school and now is a really successful attorney. To just point out that sometimes we think in terms of pass or fail too much. We think in terms of black and white. And part of that high stakes idea is a trauma response. Right? We are afraid it might trigger our own feelings of failure or insecurity or what happened in our own childhood that we haven't looked at, or somebody that we know that dropped out and it took their life, something dramatic like that. That those kinds of things happen. We put together this. I've done it. I think it's a natural kind of side effect of doing this work. When I thought to myself, I have all the tools, I have all the skills that anyone should need to be able to do this thing, and I can control, I can guarantee that my children aren't going to walk down that path, is what I thought. And my children, of course, they could sense that. And that's way too much pressure. That's way too much anxiety. That's way too simple of a definition of failure and success. And my firstborn got the worst of it, right? And he struggled significantly in a lot of areas. And I can see my participation in that dynamic because everything was high stakes. You don't. It's important for us to learn to let our children fall, not fall down an entire flight of stairs, but it's important for us to let them fall when we can. The goal of life is to become who you are, to figure yourself out, and adolescence is the time to do that. And yet, we as parents in our culture have parsed out this time of life a to be what we think is the predictor of a human being's overall success. Can you imagine what a bad combination of variables that is to occur at the same time? The child's development is about discovering who they are. And the culture and our energy, and I'll say this for myself, is often this is the most critical time to set a foundation for your overall success in life. Those two ideas are a horrible match. They're a horrible match. Sometimes there are learning differences. I've told the story that I can remember one specific incident because maybe because it was the first time that it occurred to me consciously, I got called on by a middle school teacher and I wasn't paying attention. And I didn't have any learning differences. I didn't have any struggles with school if I put effort into it. So that I didn't even have that. No learning differences. But in this particular moment, I wasn't paying attention. I was talking to someone else and he called on me. Mr. Jasper, that's his name. Mr. Jasper, Venado Middle School in Irvine, California. And I remember being embarrassed. And so I made a joke. I said something sarcastic. Everybody laughed. My anxiety was relieved. And I remember thinking after that and since then, if I, who don't have a learning disability, felt that the solution to just getting called on one time where I wasn't paying attention was to become a disruptive behavioral problem in the class, can you imagine what it must feel like for somebody who's trying to pay attention, but something about their neurology, their atypical way of processing information limits their ability to take it in, to process it, and then to spit back out, regurgitate it back out, an answer or a thoughtful participation in the subject? Can you imagine what that does? So testing for learning disabilities. Too many people in my career have discovered their learning disabilities late in life and have said, it's happened in my family, and have said, if I'd only known about this younger, it would have saved me a lot of time, a lot of pain, a lot of struggle. Again, mental health issues like depression, anxiety, social situational anxiety can be a part of it. This starts to move into, I'm going to make a big pitch tonight, to strongly consider and look for alternative routes for getting an education and a high school degree. There are credit recovery programs that are available in virtually all of our communities. There are one-on-one opportunities to go to school. There are schools that cater to certain learning disabilities. There's online options which existed before the pandemic and now have become more robust and are accepted as mainstream. You know, I am a huge fan. I'm just going to say this, I'm a huge fan of education. I believe education might be the most important thing. If I could identify one thing in the world, if I could wave a magic wand and change one idea, one variable in the world that would make the world a better place, it would be that everybody become educated and that their education include an exposure to a wide variety of topics in sociology and psychology and philosophy and art and reading and literature, the liberal arts. I believe that would go a long way toward improving the world. So that's my background. Having said that, there are topics in school that are that we're not inclined to. Math, biology might not be your thing, and yet it's an important part of a core curriculum. It's something that somebody who, I used to say when I was in school, because I hated math, I used to say, like so many kids, I'm never going to use this. And of course, the joke today is, well, the teacher would say, well, you need to understand basic math because you're not going to be walking around with a calculator in your pocket all the time, which of course, now all of us walk around with a calculator all the time. I have one on my wrist all the time in my Apple Watch. Oops. And there's the evidence. Siri just talked to me. So part of it is to get outside of the box, to start getting creative. It's labor intensive, but your child might not fit into this large machine for a variety of reasons, from cognitive functioning to innate mental health challenges. And using behavioral theory and leverage to shove them into a box that they don't fit into, but with using more leverage, isn't going to improve the situation. There might be substance abuse that's coming up. If substance abuse is introduced to a child, the likelihood of them struggling in school is going to be significant. And we should also remember that there's a huge tie between substance abuse and antisocial personality issues, right? Rebellion and learning differences. There's a huge correlation between those things. So children are more likely to end up with legal interventions and in the system if they have ADHD than not, by a large factor. They're more likely to be criticized. In fact, it's assumed that they experience about 20,000 more statements of criticism during their school age years if they have ADHD. That's what the research says. That is a lot. That's a lot. Get support from somebody. As you're going through this process and navigating impossibly difficult waters. Our relationship to our phones today, to technology today, is unimaginable 10 years ago. So it's not reasonable for children not to be involved in technology, but that brings with it, as you know, a tremendous number of challenges. Social media exposure and all the potential harm that comes there. Addictive, repetitive behaviors, especially for somebody who might be neurologically atypical, or that's a very soothing thing for them to engage in. A lot of people get social needs. It's very normal now to be married after having met on an app, on a dating app. 15, 20 years ago, we didn't think like that. That was rare. Those were strange people. Today, that's the norm. So you're going to need to think through these things critically, and you're going to need to do it in real time. As my daughter, my 16-year-old, at least she'll be 16 in a few days, said to us not too long ago, she said, "I'm beginning to realize that we've never done this before. I've never done this before," she said. "And you've never done this before." In a very real sense, I've never done this before. Even though she's my fourth of four children, I have never raised a child who's 16 in 2023. This is my first time. And the world of 2023 is so different than it was in 2013 and 2003 and 1993 and backwards before the internet and so forth and so on. So get support. It's a practice. Make therapy a practice. You can attend 12-step support groups like Al-Anon, CODA, Adult Children of Alcoholics, or Refuge Recovery. I say that every time, but it's important. Spend time around other people who are involved in the spiritual journey that occurs when you have somebody in your life that is self-sabotaging, that isn't responding to reason or typical behavioral management, alcoholism, drug addiction, other kinds of addiction. Spend time around those people and ask them how they find their peace, their serenity. And the wonderful, crazy paradox of all of this is the more you do that work, the more effective and influential you are with other people in your lives. When Obi-Wan Kenobi in the first Star Wars uttered that now famous line, "These are not the droids you're looking for," where he kind of hypnotized the stormtroopers, what George Lucas was trying to illustrate very consciously was when you become a Jedi, when you realize that the work is internal, when you realize that there's no escaping feelings, that you have to deal with them. Because that's what the dark side represented, is people that didn't want to deal with painful feelings, right? Darth Vader didn't want his wife to die. And that was the final selling point to go to the dark side, is that he was promised that if he followed these ways, control, intimidation, hierarchy, power, that if he followed these ways, that he could stop death. That's what he was promised. You compare that to the Jedis, and it was, you just learn to feel and to be present with what is. But that famous scene where Obi-Wan Kenobi said, "These are not the droids you're looking for," represents how it feels when you have developed this way of being. It feels like you can control the universe. You can't, and you know that you can't, and you've accepted that you can't, but that's what it feels like. That's what it seems like. You become more influential. When I teach therapists about attachment-based therapy, which in essence is Jedi training, when I teach therapists about this, they will stop me and they'll say, "Brad, we have been hired by people. We're getting hired by people to change their children. This attachment stuff doesn't seem like it's getting to the point," they will tell me in essence. "We've been hired to change children." And my response to them, "I know what you've been hired to do. This is how you do it. You do it by not doing it that way. You change behavior by not trying to change behavior." If what we're learning, and I believe that the vast majority of the people that are listening to this broadcast have heard these ideas because it's becoming part of mainstream culture now. When we know that trauma is at the root of mental illness and its symptoms and addiction, when we know that now, and we've always, Freud knew that in the beginning, that was the whole idea of psychotherapy, but now we have the science to back it up, besides just his observation and logic, which was incredible. When we know that trauma is at the root of it, we stop treating behaviors as the problem, and that is terrifying to us. It goes against everything that we were taught. I was just thinking the other day, I'm going to go off on a little bit because I don't have, like I said, as much content as usual. I was thumbing through my social media and I came across this classic guitarist playing a Led Zeppelin song. And I watched the entire video. I've been learning guitar the last few years, and so I get a lot of guitar playing and a lot of guitar instruction on my social media feed. So I'm watching this classic guitarist play a Zeppelin song, and I'm watching and I'm like, first of all, I love Led Zeppelin growing up, and I love their music, and I can play a couple of their songs. But I'm watching this song and I'm like, oh my gosh, what a, a masterpiece this song was. What an absolutely beautiful piece of art Jimmy Page created, the guitarist for Led Zeppelin. And I remember thinking about what I heard about Led Zeppelin growing up, that they were, they sold their souls to the devil, and if you played Stairway to Heaven backwards, it said all this satanic, crazy stuff, and these long-haired hippie, irreverent derelicts were out there making loud, obnoxious music. Now, people that I'm talking to realize that Jimmy Page and Robert Plant and John Bonham were geniuses, musical geniuses, always have been. I was telling this to my daughter last night, telling her this story. And she's like, Dad, it's the same thing today with the rap music that I listen to. And I said, it is. I know. I remember when Pete Townsend was asked, he's the lead guitarist for The Who, and also wrote a lot of their songs and sang on some of them. Some of you, if you know rock and roll, know who he is. And Pete Townsend was asked when rap music was just getting its start. Some interviewer was asking Pete Townsend about his, what would he say to these new rappers? And there was a part of it that was implying that Pete should be critical of it. And Pete said, I think we just need to get out of the way and let them do their thing. When is it going to be that the aging generation doesn't think that the growing up, the young generation is ruining the world? When are we going to finally wake up to the idea that every generation thinks that? My grandparents thought that Elvis Presley was basically the devil. That's what they thought. My mother was banned from getting his albums when she was a teenager, of anything that had anything to do with him. Now we look at Elvis Presley as harmless. In fact, he's so old that he's in the generation older than us, right? Liked by them. When's it going to be that we're going to wake up to this cycle? That the new generation they're struggling, right? They don't have it all figured out, but they're breaking free of the previous generation's conditioning, and in that way, and I have this belief, they're making the world a better place. It's messy, but it always has been messy. Can you accept, discover, and explore alternative educational options? Like I said, Fusion Academy was just one example, one-on-one teaching. There are online school options. Like I said, you can do something else. Ask yourself, is it possible? 20 years from now, what we think about traditional schools isn't going to be true anymore. The world that our children are going to live in when they're our age will be so different than the world that we live in today that it's unimaginable. Right? When AI started to become public, to come out. My son, who's an artist, said, somebody asked him as an artist, like, is that threatening for you? And he said, well, what are you talking about? I'm an artist. I will learn how to use AI as my tool. It used to be a paintbrush, and now in part it's AI. Right? AI is a tool that if you are trained in it, you can use it to do wonderful creative things. It's not its own brain acting. You use the tool that you have. Do you have access? Does it rise to the point, if you've tried everything, that I'm suggesting, if you tried to change your sensibility, if you've gotten your support, if you tried the behavioral modification, if you tried all of it, then at times the child does need to go somewhere else. And do you have the access, the resources for something like a therapeutic school, a residential treatment center, or wilderness therapy like a boat? It's not the first thing that we have. It's not the first choice, but it rises to that level. It's not a failure, right? My favorite writer about child development said very clearly, a mother who is not especially, this is a quote, a mother who is not especially nurturing can provide for the child what the child needs if only that mother will allow the child to get it from somebody else. It's speaking of mothers specifically, it was written in 1979 by a woman, by the way, and that's the way we thought of parenting is just mothers only at that time. But the point is, part of what we can do for our children is allow them to get it some other way, to stretch us, to get outside of what's familiar, what's comfortable. A friend of mine is married to Audra McDonald. You might know Audra McDonald if you're a Broadway fan. She's an incredible singer, Juilliard trained. She's won more Tonys uh, than any other person in history for acting in Broadway on Broadway. And when she won her last Tony, she, in an emotional moment, thanked her parents for not just putting her on ADHD medication, but getting her involved in the arts and drama. She got a lot of backlash and even an article from a prestigious editor criticizing her and saying some people need that. And she responded empathically and wonderfully. She felt really bad. She didn't mean that it wasn't okay for some people. She was just grateful for her particular path. So part of the job is the child is asking us for something that they're not getting, and it's our job to understand what that ask is and to see if we can find ways to do it. I love Goodwill Hunting. It's one of my favorite. I resonate with it so much. And the character played by Robin Williams, Sean the therapist, is one of my favorite examples in movie and media of a fictional story of a therapist. He's so good. So there's this scene where they're sitting at the bar and Sean is talking to his old college buddy, who is this traditional academic scholar, super successful. And this scholar has found this guy that needs therapy. He's a genius. This kid is a genius, played by Matt Damon. He's an absolute genius, but he's got a ton of psychological issues. So he's asking if Sean will help him, and Sean is trying to help him, but Sean doesn't care about the grades in the school. Sean is trying to heal this kid's soul. So this is the scene in the bar. Sean says, they're sitting in a bar, and he says, "Hey, Jerry," sitting across from his old college buddy. "In the 1960s, there was a young man that graduated from the University of Michigan, did some brilliant work in mathematics, specifically bounded harmonic functions. Then he went on to Berkeley. He was assistant professor. He showed amazing potential. Then he moved to Montana and blew the competition away." Dr. Lambeau, the Harvard math professor, and his friend responds by saying, "Yeah, so who was he?" Sean said, "Ted Kaczynski." Lambeau says, "Haven't heard of him." Then Sean yells to the bartender. He says, "Hey, Timmy." Bartender says, "Yo." Sean says, "Who's Ted Kaczynski?" And Timmy, the bartender, responds and says, "He's the Unabomber." It's important that we work on the soul. And I know we all want our children to be able to provide for themselves. But attachment is more important than all of this. Attachment is, first of all, our own work. It's based on our own work. We know that from the research. It's based on our own healing, our own introspection. That's the starting place. In other words, it starts with the connection to ourselves. That's where it starts. And then secondarily from there, it's to be able to give the child, to respond to the child and what they genuinely need, to see the child. Not to see our projections onto the child, but to actually see the real child that's in front of us. And even a child that doesn't go wayward, a child that doesn't struggle with significant mental health issues. If it goes well, it's going to stretch you. It needs to. One of my favorite ideas is that raising children is not an opportunity to teach the child about life. Raising children is an opportunity to relearn life. My 4 children are my best teachers by a long shot. And I don't think of myself as their teacher. I think of them as my teacher. I try to create an atmosphere, a way of being around them where they feel okay. And I fail at it, of course, and have to make repairs all the time when I do. But that's what it means to try to parent from an attachment-based place. And paying attention to the markers of behavior can be helpful. They can cause you to ask questions, but that's not the issue. I've shared with you, some of you know, I dropped out of high school in 10th grade. My daughter said to me the other day, she said, "Dad, why can't I just drop out of high school like you did when you were in 10th grade?" And then I shared with her the series of coincidences that happened later. And I said, "Yeah, but it was luck. I found my way, but it was my path. It's not yours." And she chuckled because she knew some of the circumstances and she did not want to repeat them. But yeah, I dropped out of school when I was 16. Didn't go back until I was about 18 and did some credit recovery and got a high school degree. Then went away and did something for a few years and then started college when I was 21. My first semester of college, I was 21 years old. Ended up getting straight A's and graduating in 3.5 years. And then on to graduate school, a PhD. But I had to get myself sorted out right. And from 14 to 18, I couldn't do it. I was I was struggling too much. School was not my priority. Home life was scary and difficult and painful and lonely, and I didn't have what it took. And my parents, my mother specifically, was doing the best that they could, doing the best that she could, specifically. But I had to find my way. When I was raising my first son, my first child, and he was struggling in very, very similar ways, spooky similar ways to the where I was struggling. My therapist simply said to me one day during a session when I was struggling about what to do, she said, "What's your goal?" And I said, I just want to be a support and a resource to him. And she said, "I think that's a really great thought." She said, "I would keep that in mind when you're making your decisions about how to treat him." I stopped becoming behaviorally focused. I started working on the connection and the understanding. He figured things out really quickly. I think it was a good, it was a lucky piece of timing. But I became a part of the solution. He got sober. He's been sober since for the past 14, 15 years. And he also went on to college, graduated with a master's degree in organizational psychology, and now is living his best life. If you'd asked me when he was 16, I would have said, "We'll be lucky if he doesn't end up in jail. We'll be lucky if all of his friends don't end up in jail." And now they're all wonderful human beings, many of them married with children, living their best lives. Our fear is the enemy. Our anxiety is the enemy. And like that quote I read at the beginning, if we don't grapple with our own fear, if we don't grapple with our own anxiety, it will come out on our children and our partners as a projection. It will look like anger and criticism. We will be trying to shape them up so that we feel good inside. This doesn't mean that you're passive. This doesn't mean that you don't do anything. This doesn't mean that you can't have boundaries because you can. You can do all of this, but it comes from a different place. It comes with a different perspective. And The Price of Privilege, a book that was written by Dr. Madeline Levine, where she discovered that all of her clients essentially had one thing in common, and that is that their children, their parents were trying to raise them to be good children instead of to be themselves. This is her conclusion. And one of the statements that she made was this. She says, "And it is emotional closeness, maternal warmth in particular, that is as close as we get to a silver bullet against psychological impairment. Behavioral modification is virtually never mentioned by psychologists today as the key ingredient in raising healthy, resilient children." I take this quote from Stephen Mitchell, Influence and Autonomy in Analysis, in Psychoanalysis. And I love this quote. I'm going to highlight the middle part. I highlighted it the other night. He wrote, "The emphasis when talking about therapy and therapists and analysts, but we can borrow from therapy and therapists and analysts and we can borrow the principles and apply them to us as parents because the roles are similar enough. Dr. Mitchell wrote, the emphasis of the work is not in the behaviors, but on rigorous thinking. It's not, in other words, in what do you do? What should I do? But rather it's on rigorous thinking, not on constraints, he goes on to say, but on self-reflective emotional involvement. You have to look at yourself. What's my participation? What's my contribution? Not on the application of general truths, but on imaginative participation. This suggests, he says, a very different sort of technique. And here's the key. The discipline is not in the procedures. It's not in what you do, but in the sensibility through which the analyst participates. In other words, the way you are with the client. That's what changes the client. Not the interventions, but your way of being. There is no generic solution or technique, he says. There is a great deal of disciplined thought in the skilled practice of clinical psychoanalysis and continual complex choices. That's my paradigm for parenting. This particular quote hangs on the wall where we do our staff training each week. I know it would be nice to give a list of behavioral ideas, a step-by-step. I've been asked to actually create step-by-step, and I'm working on it. But I'm trying to work on it in this context. It's a way of being with somebody. My greatest impact on a client is how I am with them, how I feel about them, how I respond to them. That difference, the fact that I don't have anxiety about their failures, their struggles, how they're doing in school. And it's easy to do, by the way. It's a lot easier to do with my clients than it is with my own children. I want to be very clear about that. I have an advantage with your children that you don't have, and it is that I am not their parent. And my identity and ego is not tied up in their successes and failures like it is with my own children at times. So just because I have a broader perspective when I'm working with your child, I am more helpful to them than I am with my own children, where my anxiety, my fear, my agenda gets in the way of the connection between me and them. How we think about our children, this is also from the Journey of the Heroic Parent. How we think about our children is more important than what we do to them. The quality of an intervention or behavioral technique is not as important as how we hold our children in our mind. If we see them as bad, broken, or sick, it doesn't matter what we do. Our anxiety will leak out subtly, and all they will see is that we think that they are bad. It is critical that we learn to see them and their goodness, even when their behavior makes it difficult. We have to at least respond with curiosity. As Khalil Gibran says, they're not your children. They come through you, but they are not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. Do not seek them to make them like you, but rather seek to become like them. For life doesn't go backwards. So the work is difficult and painful and transformative and growth producing and expanding. It's not the application of general ideas to make sure that you get the child that you think that you need to get. Your idea about what a child should be. So here are my conclusions, my take homes. And I put them under the heading of complexities because it's all complex stuff. Attachment trumps behavioral compliance. Attachment is more important. And while with my fourth born, we're on I got to tell you, a much more difficult, complex process with her than on my firstborn, I'm proud of it. It's scary. I'm often anxious, but I refuse to let my anxiety cause me to cling to things that tell me that I can control things. I refuse, in essence, to succumb to the dark side like Darth Vader and to try to control her. And I'm sure that I've done things and that I do things that other parents and educators would say, you're screwing her up. But it's almost become a sign to me that I must be doing something right. Because if the dominant culture tells me that I'm doing it wrong, that's a good sign. Even my daughter said to me, she said, Dad, I heard you mention this thing about you're only as happy as your least happy child thing before. She said, my teacher mentioned it in school today. her, by the way, 10th grade sociology teacher that she loves. And I said, I do mention it, but I point out that it's insane that when a child adheres to that idea that you're only as happy as your least happy child, the child then becomes responsibility, is burdened with the parent's peace of mind and serenity. If the child is sad or struggling and the parent isn't happy, on top of their own sadness and pain, they now are responsible for making the person that loves them the most unhappy. It is your job to find your own happiness. It is your job to find it somewhere else, not through your child. So we have to, even from that very common idiom in our own culture, we have to break free of that thinking. Act as if what we've learned about trauma is true. Act as if it's true. Act as if addressing the underlying issues is more important than the behavioral compliance. Act as if attachment, first to yourself and then to the child's real self, is a more important indicator of the child's overall mental health and resiliency throughout life. Act as if that's true and see what happens. There's no clear path and simple answers. See, we want dogma. We want simple steps. We want 10 commandments or 5 commandments or 20 commandments. We want those. We want absolutes. I was thinking about this the other day. What I love about science is that science is willing to learn something new tomorrow. Science embraces not knowing. And sometimes when we're attracted to dogma, we want to have all the answers because we don't want to feel anxious and afraid. But again, if we don't grapple with our fear at a spiritual level, not a spiritual bypass level, if we don't grapple with our fear, we don't grow. And if we cling to rules and generic solutions and dogma and behavioral contracts as a way of managing our anxiety, the child pays for it. We all pay for it. There are no guarantees, no clear path, no simple answers, no guarantees. It is just as much of a difficult process for us as it is for them. And you get to decide. If you listen to this, if you read my book and you think, screw it, I like the idea of behavioral contracts, you get to decide. I won't try to talk you out of it even a little bit. Sometimes you have to try that, and sometimes it works. Sometimes you apply a little pressure and a little leverage, and the child complies, and everybody seems fine. But that's not the case with the kids and the families that we tend to treat. It tends to be not that simple. And importantly, I'll end with this story. I love this. I don't know if you've seen this. Have you seen the movie? I won't get an answer from you. About Time. It's a wonderful, interesting movie. And the premise is that the men in a certain family can go back they go into a dark closet and they think about a certain time and then go back to it and relive it back up to the present. You can go back a minute, a day, a year, anything that you can remember, you can go back to. And as the father in this story is teaching this to his young adult son, who finds it to be a joke at first, the son finally asks him, he says to his dad, he says, "Dad, what's one piece of advice?" And the dad said, "My advice is to live every day twice." And then it shows this young man, and he's at this point has a wife, and he's a lawyer. I don't know what they call lawyers in England. He's whatever they call lawyers in England. He's a lawyer, and he's walking through this building, and he's dropping papers, and he's stressed out. And then he goes back and lives the day again, having known that everything turned out okay. And he drops the papers, and he looks up, and he sees the ceiling looks as beautiful as the Sistine Chapel. And he notices the proverbial roses along the way. You're okay. You're okay. And if you had the necessary attachment to from your childhood, you would know that. You would know that you're okay and that you're going to be okay. You would know that you can feel all of life's pain and loss and sadness and difficulty, and you can be okay. And you would know that your confidence comes not because you know everything is going to turn out exactly the way that you want, but because of you, because you're connected to you. And I believe I am in line with what Joseph Campbell taught when he said that's what the prophets and the spiritual teachers have meant when they talk about nirvana or heaven. That connection to self. Alan Watts talks about this idea. That the idea is when you have that connection, when you know yourself, not your good self, that's just a slice of you, but all of you, and you've made peace with it, you're home. You are the home that you seek. And when you know that through this work, you have a completely different response, a completely different feeling toward your child and their academic struggles. You absolutely do. And you realize that the game is much, much longer than what your anxious brain will tell you. All right, folks. Thanks for your patience. I know I went a little bit over tonight. I'll run through the upcoming announcements. I'm going to be off next week, so I'm going to tell you what my next broadcast will be. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, which I've quoted from this evening, and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. If you want to do a deep dive, a springboard into your own work, or something that will help accelerate your work, Finding You is our offering. January 17th through 21st is the next offering. That's a Wednesday through a Sunday. We also have an online option, which is cheaper half the time and over a weekend. So if time and money are limited resources in your life, the online option is a wonderful one that we started during the pandemic. And I was so pleased with its outcomes that we decided to keep it after the lockdown happened. If you want a sequel, if you've been to Returning to You, excuse me, if you've been to Finding You, the sequel that we have and that we run is called Returning to You. You can come back again and again. March 6th through 10th, I'll be running that one. And then the Finding Connection workshop to be run by myself and my wife, who's also a therapist, February 7th through 11th. That will fill up. We have a couple of couples already. There's a couple of spots left. We have custom Finding Connection for couples and co-parents options, and also Finding Family Intensives. Contact intensives at evoketherapy.com for more information. We have support groups. For wilderness families, December 21st is the next offering at 7 p.m. And then once a month, we have an alumni only offering. January 17th at 6 p.m. is that next offering. And then a once a month intensives offering, intensive support group. February 13th is our next offering, 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Actually, there might be a January. There is a January one. Go to our website or email supportgroups@evoketherapy.com to find out more. We have family treks options for families that want to do outdoor work with their children in the middle of the program, at the end of the program, in between programs, or even if your child is not in the program. A 3 to 5 day experiential trek into the wilderness with our therapeutic staff and therapists. Just contact admissions@evoketherapy.com. We have online coaching services available now. Therapists and other coaches that are trained in the attachment-based model. This is for parents, for couples, for families, or for individuals. So because of the pandemic, a lot more people are comfortable with doing this kind of work online. You can do it anywhere with any one of our coaches. We have more than 40 coaches to choose from. Contact coaching@evoketherapy.com to find out if there's a good fit for you. We ask all current clients, all current parents to try, to experiment, to give a try to at least 6 of any of the following 12-step support groups: Alana.org, Coda.org, familiesanonymous.org, or adultchildren.org. Also, refugerecovery.org is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program, and the National Alliance on Mental Illness at NAMI.org has free classes and resources in your local communities. All of these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just go there and search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer, subscribe, like, share, rate us. We'd love to hear from you. Or you can watch the rebroadcast of any of these the next day on Evoke's YouTube channel. You can find Evoke Therapy programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on X, Threads, and Instagram using the handles @EvokeTherapy and @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can also find Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives, and on Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives, And of course, our blog has wonderful content. And I love the most recent blog written by Corey Wright about the difficult conversation around wilderness that we need to have with people. All right, I'm going to be off next week. I have 3 immediate family members with birthdays leading up to the December 25th holiday. So I'll be working and celebrating and supporting them and enjoying them next week. I'll be back on December 26th. That's a Tuesday, the day after Christmas, at 6 p.m. Mountain Time, where I'll be hosting a live open forum question and answer for sibling, families, and friends. You can always email us at webinar@evoketherapy.com for questions, suggestions, requests for slides of any of our broadcasts, or just to submit a question in advance for the open forum. All right, folks, thanks for joining me this evening. I hope this has been a helpful point of contact. I hope this has helped you to think about things a little bit differently. That's my goal. And for and on behalf of the people that love you and the people that you love, thank you for showing up to these broadcasts and listening and being willing to do your work. It makes a big difference. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.